but I will just take a couple of seconds just to very briefly explain that. And then what we will do is start discussions related to this particular unit. So I will just take a couple of seconds. That's great. So basically, we've got the recording now on, and for those of you who have joined, thanks for joining in. Today, we are looking at starting the People in Organization unit. This is going to be one of the first units that you're going to study in the Level 4 Extended Diploma in Management for Health and Social Care. My name is Ramanjeet Singh, and I'm going to be your tutor for this particular unit. Now, in this unit, this particular unit is also coined as People in Organization, but also relates to or can be termed as Human Resources Management. One of the key things that we look at in health and social care is communication and the people as resources. So it is very important for us to understand from this context, let's say, the importance of communication and people working within teams to be able to get things and objectives, things done and goals and objectives in order to fulfill the goals and objectives. So it is important for us to understand and put this into a bit of perspective from a point of view of understanding why this unit is important and why human resources in particular are very important when we look at health and social care sector in general. So this unit can also be called as Human Resources Management or Human Resources in general. And depending on, where you study this unit, this becomes an important part and parcel of how you tend to start working in, any sort of a health and social care setting. This unit will cover things like communication practices. We will look at, communication models. There are bits and pieces which, are not directly related to this particular unit, but at some stage, what I would do is primarily also, share with you some backup slides. And these backup slides would essentially be useful for you to understand what are the various communication models that we use in our day-to-day, let's say, working. And why are these quite important from a point of view of, understanding, because they help you adjust, adapt, become a part of a team. And that is where I think this will be something which will be useful for you to understand from a point of view of, communication. Now, the other thing that we look at is when people work within a particular health and social care setting, they're also looking at, working within teams. Sometimes you would see that people work, remotely as well. And when we look at the purpose of people working remotely, they might be delivering care or providing, for example, medication or looking after people remotely, and they tend to be care workers or care workers which work through home or, sometimes have to go in and provide, support to people at their homes, and that is where it also involves remote working. But again, communication tends to be the key. And in this case, when HR or when Human Resources Department looks at shortlisting people, they look at these specific skills and qualities and attributes which are required for you to be able to perform in your role, well, so that you understand the role and responsibility, and then you are able to perform as per the requirements of goals and objectives of that particular role. Now, this unit is divided into 5 learning outcomes. So we are looking at the first learning outcome, which is, with all the assessment criteria. Generally, what we will do is when we look at covering the unit, we'll be looking at covering the unit basis learning outcomes. The first learning outcome or the start of the unit also has a bit of an introduction. We'll look at a video, key terminology, and that kind of sets the pace in terms of what we are going to cover in this particular unit. So we will have 6 sessions for this particular unit, which is People in Organization. We're going to be starting with learning outcome 1 today and discuss all the assessment criteria. There'll be a session for 2, 3, 4, and 5. Towards the end, we'll also have an assignment discussion session on this unit, which basically informs us how we would go about completing and attempting the assignment, collating the evidence. So that be a separate detailed discussion, just like this session that we are having today. And in that, what we are going to do is discuss the assignment brief. Now, what is it that we go and cover in this particular session? We'll be looking at the indicative content which is given for the learning outcome. So this learning outcome, which is primarily focused on understanding communication practices within organization, will be looking at, these 4 broad elements of what are communication benefits, what are policies and procedures, what are the various legislation that we need to look at when communication is done within an organization, specifically related to government regulation. And then we'll also understand what are basically, organizational structures, and where do we see these structures panning out when we talk about, the aspect of organizational culture and how big the organization is. So when we sometimes talk about size and scale of the organization, wherein what we are going to be looking at doing is primarily going into and reading and understanding, the various different types of organizational structures. And these structures, there is a handout which I'm going to share with you. These structures, are four basic types. But what we're going to do is, at some stage, with the evolution and with the passage of time, what we have seen is that many different types of organizational structures have come up, depending on the size, the scale of the operation, the organization, and in general, when we look at, things like in terms of where the organization is working, in which particular sector it is working. And in some cases, what we have to do is look at different types of structures. So we'll go into a bit of detail, and for which what I'm going to do is obviously look at sharing with you a particular handout, and that handout would essentially cover, the organizational structures in a great amount of detail. So we'll be looking at starting the discussion on first learning outcome, and that is how, what we're going to do is obviously at some stage start looking at breaking down the content of this particular unit into various learning outcomes, and then discuss some of the, assessment criteria as well, which will allow us to clearly understand the different types of structures, relation to what you call the, let's say the policies and procedures, and what are the benefits of essentially looking at, having these structures and policies and procedures which allow teams or people within teams to effectively work together within an organizational setup. So let's look at a bit of discussion on this with regards to, the learning outcome 1, and I'm going to switch over to a presentation. These slides are going to be updated and obviously available to you on Moodle. So every session that I normally take, I will have some slides which I would prepare, and these would be available to you from Moodle, along with the copy of the lecture recording for you to review at a later stage. Now, we've covered the unit aims. I've briefly shown you what we are looking at covering in learning outcome 1. Let's start off with a bit of a terminology and understanding what do you mean by people in organization. So when we talk about, people in organization, we are looking at one of the resources which is going to be very important for the organization, because this resource can actually control and effectively look at all the other types of resources within the organization, which could be things like financial resources, administrative resources, equipment. It could be infrastructural resources. And these are bits which, basically people within the organization are able to work on. So when we talk about people in general and what are people in organization, what we are referring to is the organization having the right set of staff, employees, or workers, whichever way we call it, being able to work within that organization to be able to then help in carrying out some of the goals, rules, basically roles and responsibilities, which would help in the achievement of objectives set as per the agenda or the management of the organization. Now, generally, we'll have 3 different types of people within the organization. If we go into a bit more classification, there will be people like value creators or problem solvers. There are people who are basically going to be in passive roles, and there are people who are going to be problem creators. And essentially, sometimes when we look at classifying different types of people, we will look at, this broad classification. Now, this is not something which is fixed. It can essentially change, because when we look at some of the team building models in the subsequent sessions, in Learning Outcome 2, we'll discuss Dr. Belbin's model of team roles. We'll also discuss Dr. Tuckman's model of team building, and that is where we'll go into a bit more details of how and what are the various classifications of roles within the organization which people actually take up. But here, what we want to generally understand is that what are people who are, when we say people within different organizations have different roles, and these roles could typically tend to be in operation, production, engineering. You could be working within, for example, if I talk about a health and a social care setup, if it's a hospital, you would be working in administration in the front desk. You could be working as a nurse, a doctor, a practitioner. So when I say the word practitioner, I could include things like physiotherapists, nurses, healthcare workers, healthcare assistant, doctors, consultants. They're all practitioners, and they are all covering different parts of the role within the organization. And some of them, depending on the title and obviously, their work remit, would occupy some positions, and these positions would be helping in the day-to-day functions of the hospital or the organization. Let's listen into a particular video which emphasizes on why is communication important in a workplace, because in the first learning outcome we need to understand communication practices. So let me just show you this short video, which is a video which basically highlights what are communication practices, and this is what we want to look at essentially. Just as a let me put it this way, as a brief session, introduction to understanding what would be the role of communication within a particular organization. So let me just share the screen.
So amongst all of the skills that employers look for in leaders in particular, but in all employees, communication skills are very high. There are very few jobs that you can do without needing to communicate with colleagues or with customers. In fact, I can't really even think of one, to be honest. There's always a need to share what you're doing, what you're up to, what you're working on, any challenges or problems that you might have, and to engage with people. Now, certainly certain roles, it's much more important than in others, but it's one of those absolutely key things that runs through every element of employment and employability. Your ability to engage and communicate with other people. That's absolutely critical. And I would say every role I've recruited for has been important. And that's not just in terms of written communication, verbal communication is just as important as well.
So as you can see, this very short video basically focuses on, the role of communication within the organization. And she essentially, when we look at this particular video, Rebecca Fielding, she's an experienced recruiter, and she's obviously looked at the processes of, understanding why is it important, when they recruit people, to be able to, look at the process of communication, and why is it very important as an aspect, as an attribute, as a behavior when we talk about in general people working within an organization or an organizational kind of a setup. So here, when we look at the models of communication, what I've done is I've put some slides primarily, but I'll briefly take you through them. Now, when we talk about communication as a process, this is, when we talk about communication, like I'm currently delivering a lecture, you on the other side, we are using technology like Zoom meetings, but you on the other side are able to, understand and obviously hear in or listen into what I'm essentially saying. Now, if we look at this bit that I'm doing in terms of communication, it is a process. It is not a one-way it's not a one-way channel through which I'm only speaking, but this is a two-way communication process. And this would typically involve, if I break the components down of what this process is, it'll basically have 5 different components. So when I'm speaking, I'm termed as the sender. And when you're receiving, you're basically termed as the receiver, the person on the other side or the recipient of who is actually receiving what I'm saying. Now, how does the message travel? The message is being encoded using a software through Zoom meetings, then it gets transmitted over the internet. And then at your end, before you receive the message, you are decoding it because you're logged into Zoom meetings, and that message then gets decoded, and then you receive that message at your end, and you are able to understand what I'm actually talking about. Now, when you ask me a question through the chat route, or when you say something and you ask a query, or you interject during the course of my discussion, what you're providing me is a bit of a feedback to say that I'm able to understand you, or I'm able to essentially understand what you're essentially saying. And what you do is, what I'm saying, you comprehend, and then you respond back, and that process completes this whole cycle of communication. So somebody is sending a message, you are on the other end receiving the message, and then when you relay back with a bit of either nodding your head, or typing something in the chat window, or interjecting in with me while we are discussing, or you respond back, that is the feedback, and that part of it completes the process. Now, initially, when I started, you texted me to say that I'm not able to hear you. So that could be termed as a bit of noise. That means disturbance or some sort of a hindrance, which is actually a hurdle or an hindrance, which is actually impeding us to speak to each other using this particular software called Zoom meeting. So when we look at noise is described as hindrance or hurdles which can be put or experienced when this process of communication is essentially happening. So just to look at a brief idea, this tends to be how the process of communication happens. Now, this can be termed and translated into a basic model of communication. So as a sender, which is me, the lecturer or the tutor, I'm sending a message which is basically showing you PowerPoint slides. You're receiving it at your end. And if you have any questions and queries, you're asking, counter checking with me, or interjecting in terms of discussions. And that feedback coming to me is essentially, or that message coming back to me is essentially termed as feedback. And this particular process becomes a simple model of communication. And now we don't get to see this or realize that this is how it works. But sometimes when we are having a close conversation with one of our colleagues who's in the same room, or sitting with you, and you're having a conversation, it's a two-way process. You're saying something, the person is understanding, they're responding back to you, and that is a process of communication. Now, there are various different models of communication. Depending on the medium, depending on how you're communicating, there are, at least 8 different models that we look at, which are, prevalent and widely accepted as the work has been done by various, scientists, psychologists, over the years. Number of people have worked on these particular models, and they have now become more or less sacrosanct with the understanding that these are widely accepted, and they can be used in different settings to communicate message to your audience. Now, I won't go into all the models and the detailing of all the models, but generally what I've done is I put one slide essentially talking about each type of model. Now, Aristotle's model is basically a model focused on presentation or speech. So here the communication tends to be one way, more or less. It's like you're attending a rally, or you're going to a lecture, or you're essentially, in a place wherein you are being addressed by a leader, or you're in a training or a seminar wherein the trainer is the main, person who's producing the content and is talking to you, and you are essentially one of the recipients who's receiving the message. So this tends to be Aristotle's model. We also have Laswell's model. This model of communication is generally, something that we see when we work, and obviously, look at, say, for example, working within a large team. And what you would generally see is that in some cases, when formal communication has to be done, this formal communication is controlled or, effectively done by a set of people. And this particular model tends to be what is called also the linear model of communication. And it is something which is regarded as one of the most influential communication models. So think of it as a press release or as a press conference, which is where, for example, if news briefings, essentially when they're happening, you generally see that there could be a person who would take up the role of a communicator. They would be sending across a message. They'll be using a particular medium to amplify the message. For example, if I look at a news presenter, that message would be going to thousands, hundreds, thousands, and millions of people who would be receiving the message through a particular device. But in some cases, here again, the feedback part of the process does not come in. So this kind of communication is where you'd see generally, when we look at press releases, televisions, radios, and channels through which one-to-many communication can be done. Similarly, we have Warren Weaver model. You also have Berlow's model. You have the Scaram's model, and then you have Riley's model, and then you have the contemporary model. Now, the contemporary model is the model of communication, which is what we generally see in our day-to-day working within organizations, whether it's a hospital, a surgery, a nurse, a pharmacy, or any sort of a setting. This is the normal model wherein we see communication being a two-way process. And there are a number of people participating in this process, and they participate in feedback in order for the main presenter or the communicator to understand that the message is being understood. And that is what tends to work when we look at most situations in terms of organizations when we work in, or in places of work, we would normally see the contemporary model of communication being used. So there are some backup slides which are put towards the end, and these slides can then be used to go into a bit of detailing, to understand, I would say, communication models. So this is something which probably you would need to know and have this as a context to be able to get into understanding the communication practices that we want to learn and go into a bit of detail in today's learning outcome. Any questions on this so far? Any questions?
No, I don't have any questions. No.
All right, okay, no worries. So let's get into some of the. Sorry, Vanessa, go on.
But
Yes.
on the learning outcome 1.1 organization, do you think we should include like the process, the communication process and all that, or we should just like have an introduction of what communication is, then, for example, the characteristics of effective communication, then therefore we add on the benefits of should we include all this, or we should just focus on what the question wants us to do? For example, in this context, just give the benefits of effective communication organization. Please guide me on that.
Sure. So what we normally do is, before we discuss, any of the assessment criteria, these are 1.1, 1.2, what we look at is basically theoretical frameworks, because what we want to do is, obviously at some stage we will get into doing the tasks, but what we also want to do is understand the background in terms of why this is to be studied or why this is important. And that is where what we do is we basically cover theoretical frameworks which are related to the key indicative content of the learning outcome. So sometimes you would have some learning outcomes in which we will need to look at theory, and then that theory we will be looking at explaining or going into a bit of detail by looking at examples and then showing the implementation of the example to cover that topic in detail. So generally speaking, when we look at going back to what you're asking in terms of how you would address or how you would go about, I think in some cases when you start doing the assignment, you would do a balance of three things. If there are tasks which normally talk about and this is something which we'll go into in detail in discussions in the assignment discussion session, but just very briefly providing you a bit of an outline here. Sometimes when we do the tasks, you'll have different types of words, which are called command verbs: explain, describe, define, analyze, compare, evaluate. So some of these words have meanings which we look at in terms of their definitions. And then depending on what this command verb is for that particular task, sometimes you have to cover not just the theory, but you have to explain the theory with a key framework or a model. Then you have to look at underpinning the theory, which is by looking at building arguments to explain why this is the case or how this can be put into practice. And then towards the end, what you do is you highlight or you put an example, and that would basically be looking at showing the theoretical framework that you have discussed in action. So depending on the tasks that we do at a later stage in the assignment brief, sometimes it'll be a case of writing and covering three things, which will be basically theory, and then looking at advantages, disadvantages, pros and cons of why this theory is established as a framework or as a model. And then towards the end, we show the application by taking an example, and that would be, the requirement of the task. But when we look at studying the unit, we'll be looking at studying it holistically. So we'll not just straight away go on to the tasks and focus on what the task is asking, but we'll be looking at wherever necessary details are required as per the indicative content. The lectures or the lecturers will essentially cover these theoretical frameworks as well, so that you are able to understand the context and the pretext of it, of why this has been included in the unit, and thereby gaining knowledge which is required for you to understand the unit as a whole and the topic as a whole. Is that okay?
Yes, that's fine.
So for some of these topics, like for example, as I mentioned to you earlier, organizational structures, we'll cover that in assessment criteria 1.3 or 1.4. We will give you an additional handout to study, because sometimes it will be difficult for us to cover everything in the presentation in detail, although as you will see, most of the slides will be very detailed, but the detailing of it would be by taking examples and looking at maybe visually a structure and going into details to read where this structure can be implemented in what kind of an organizational setup, and for which what I'm going to do is for every session, I will generally have, say, for example, a last slide, which is called the plenary slide, and in which what I will do is, say, for example, read the different organizational structures handout. So this would, primarily be the additional reading that you will need to do, and they would essentially be very useful for you to build your understanding on what is required overall. We are not going to be very, very focused on, obviously we are focused on covering the unit and, studying what is required, but somehow when you are doing the course, you are looking at gaining overall knowledge, on the, subject area. And that is where this would require a bit of detailing. And that detailing will essentially come from, the additional handouts that we will provide. And they would be useful for you to understand the context of it and the detailing of it. Is that okay? While you've asked me these questions, so for example, I will show you one particular handout which I'm going to provide. And this particular handout, is this handout, which is basically organizational structures, how they were formed, when they were formed, how they came about. All of these are going to be discussed, as you can see, in detail in when we look at, this particular handout. So these are things that I'm going to provide to you for additional reading, and they are going to be useful for you to develop, more detailed knowledge and understanding of the topics that we are looking at covering in the learning outcome. Is that okay? Now, let's look at going into discussing the assessment criteria 1.1. Now, it talks about analyzing the benefits of effective communication. Now, if you just put on a thinking hat for now, and then think if you are working within an organization and you have maybe a couple of colleagues who work with you in the same department or in the same function, what you would feel is that why would you think that the communication plays an important part, and how would you feel that, I get or I'm aware of most of the things which are happening in the organization because there is a common understanding on how things work. So one part is that there are policies and procedures which organization has, which people understand and have to follow through as an employee code, as a code of conduct within the organization. But generally speaking, most leaders, managers, supervisors would generally look at, ensuring that everybody is able to sing from the same songbook. That means everybody has the same similar understanding on certain key areas or topics which are related to their role. So having clear communications could transparent, honest and clear communications, such sometimes we use the word, is important to make it effective, because here employees would feel valued, that they have full understanding of what is required to be done. Generally, you would see if communication is transparent and honest between the manager and their employees, or between the owner or the director of the organization and the employees, or between your supervisor and your employees, then you would generally see your self-esteem, your morale, and say for example, your overall attitude towards the organization tends to be positive. So when we look at effective communication, it is quite important because it tends to enhance the morale of employees working within a particular setup. If you look at, for example, a hospital, every morning when people have a shift change, when they come in, the manager or the department head or the, whichever department you're working in, whether it's administration, laundry, food and services, or it's nursing, healthcare workers, they will have a morning briefing. The briefing tends to be a clear communication of what is expected to happen today, how many patients are going to be looked at, who's taking what responsibility. And in general, if you have that information to hand, what it does is it basically makes you feel positive. You approach your roles and responsibilities with a positive attitude, and generally that enhances your morale within the place of your work, that you're doing your duties on a day-to-day basis. It also is related to the fact that it improves productivity. That means clear communication minimizes or does away with any errors that can happen, because of the fact that if I say that this is the standard operating procedure, if this problem occurs, this is the manual that you follow and this is how you do it. Now, if everybody has that understanding, then there is less of chaos and obviously more of work which can be done systematically, and tasks can be executed as per the requirement, and that generally leads to improved productivity. You'd also look at, if there is good and open channel of communication amongst employees or within colleagues, there are normally stronger relationships which develop. People can depend on other colleagues or other people working within the same department or the organization, because they generally feel that they don't feel threatened because somebody else might not take up their work, or they might not have an insecurity in terms of sharing information, and that generally tends to create collaboration and a broader sense of cooperation, wherein people are able to work within teams effectively. We'll also look at other things like, if you have effective communication, you generally see that problems can be solved more effectively within organizations. If there are circumstances which throw up problems, people are able to get together and reach a solution, and that is because of the collective nature of working and their understanding of how they need to resolve the problem. In some cases, you also look at enhanced decision making. Now, this is coupled with the fact that if managers or supervisors delegate authority of decision making to people at different levels of the organization, then in those cases, what you generally see is that communication tends to be a key, wherein decision makers have the necessary data or the relevant information available to make sound decisions. And when we talk about a hospital or any sort of a medical setup, you generally see communication tends to resolve a lot of problems. So communication, say, for example, if you're treating and dealing with a patient which has, say, for example, terminal illness, and in some cases, if you speak to that patient and then you say that, can I share more responsibility or more information with your family members? If you take that particular, let's say, approval, then sharing of that information with family members, tends to create a lot of, bridges, because here the family members are willing to help and the patient feels a bit more comfortable. And as a result, what tends to happen is that you're not concealing information, but you're sharing information with all relevant people with the consent of the patient, keeping the independence and consent of the patient in mind. And that allows, customer satisfaction, or in this case, patient nurse or patient worker relationship generally to be better and improved. And in those cases, we are looking at, essentially the aspect of, even communication helping in terms of, creating a better experience for, patients within hospital, which is via integrated, communication plan, wherein all the people are involved, all the key people in providing care to that patient are involved. Things like doctors, nurses, healthcare workers, social workers, and they are all involved, and they all share the aspect of what is required to be done, so that the patient is able to get the best of the service and then able to recover as quickly as possible. So generally speaking, there are lots of benefits of effective communication, and these tend to be these that we have discussed, in the slide. Is that okay?
Yes, it's okay.
Okay. Now let's look at some of the policies and procedures. Now, when we look at a big organization, or when we look at a big hospital wherein there are, say, hundreds of people working, just as an example, if I look at a college, or if I look at a public sector organization, you look at the NHS in the UK, or you look at a hospital within a particular setup, or you look at a surgery wherein there are thousands of patients which are registered, you would generally see that all communication tends to follow some sort of policy and process. Now, it is important for the organization to have a lot of policies. As a college, we have lots of policies that you have access to on Moodle. These policies could include policies like data protection, equality and diversity, communication policy, academic misconduct policy, plagiarism policy, safeguarding policy, health and safety policy. Now, why these policies or documents are created? Because why these policies and documents are created is because we need to have some standard operating procedures that can be followed at times, which are required for everyone to understand and everyone to have a similar understanding on those policies and processes or those procedures. So in order to ensure that everybody is having the same understanding on a particular process or a particular problem when they are faced with, then they need to look at how they will go about resolving that problem. And for that, what the organization or businesses or any sort of a place has to do is, if these are going to be looked at, let's look at this way. Why do we have policy and processes? First part could be, if I put on my thinking hat and think outside the box, I think I would need a policy or a process because these things are happening repeatedly. So if things are happening repeatedly and I want to achieve the same outcome every time I carry out a series of steps or activities, i.e. a process, then in some cases, because they happen repetitively, I need to follow or have a policy essentially, so that every time I follow that process or a policy, it gives me the same output as any one of my colleagues or any one of my peers are carrying that out. So, for example, in this case, if I say, if you go in to do a blood test or do bloods in terms of a surgery and you are seen by a practice nurse, there could be a number of people going in for blood tests. But what is the simple process through which this runs? You go to the surgery, you meet the receptionist, and you say, okay, I'm here for my blood test as per this appointment. They say you take a seat. And then after that, when your name is called or your number shows up on the waiting queue, you go in and you see the practice nurse. The practice nurse will ask you certain standard questions. And, there could be questions around, say, for example, are you generally feeling okay? Are you happy for me to do your blood test? I would need to take out, say, for example, 2 test tubes of blood. Is that okay with you? And then you respond to those questions and obviously, get the blood test done. Then after that, the nurse would give you or put a Band-Aid or some sort of a, dressing on your place where the bloods have been taken, and then she'll say keep it pressed for a couple of minutes, and after that she'll put a sticking plaster on it, and then after that you leave. Then while leaving, you check with the receptionist that when will I get my results. The receptionist replies that in about 4 to 5 working days, if anything is serious, we'll get in touch with you, and the blood test reports would be available, and the doctor would give you a call, or you might need to take an appointment. Now this whole steps that I've described, the series of steps I've described, is going to have a process. This is documented because there are hundreds of thousands of patients which come in and get blood tests done every year at the surgery. You will need to have a process that will run that will basically allow the people participating in this process to run it as per the directions which are as per the guidelines which have been given in that policy, and then every time the output of that would be the same. So people like the receptionist, a registered nurse, a doctor, they are key players in this process, and they would follow this particular bit, and that is why policies and procedures would be required. Now, why they are documented and why they are written down? Because you want them to be followed to the T. That means you want to make sure that you're dotting all the I's and crossing all the T's. Everyone follows the same procedure, so that at the end of it, you are going to get the same results, and you are going to have what are called acceptable practices to which the results then can be related to. Now, when you go into a surgery or when you call an ambulance, general wait times, it's understood that as per standard operating procedure, the wait times tend to be anywhere between half an hour to 2 hours. Now, that is acceptable practice. So if this is documented in the policy, then it is clearly communicated. People who go through the policy would clearly understand this, and that is why this policy or this procedure would work, and that would be enhancing the communication within the organization. Nobody can come in and challenge to say this is not there or this is not done, because that is already documented as a procedure or as a policy and communicated to all employees, and they've been asked to go through that or get training on that when they started work in the organization. So they have a same or similar understanding on those processes, and that is why you would see the policies and procedures facilitate organized and effective communication. And communication can be done sometimes through various routes. This can be done through the route of training. It can be done through the route of integrating technology. It can be done through the route of adhering to certain compliance and legislation which is required. And that is why this tends to be an important aspect when we look at how and where are the communication policies documented, kept, and how they are communicated to employees and staff and workers, contractors working within a particular setup, so that they all have the same understanding. And this would allow essentially communication to be better or, more, let's say, useful within a particular organizational setup, whether it's hospital, whether it's a business, whether it's a surgery, pharmacy, depending on number of people working within that setup. This would, make sure that the communication is efficient and it's clear and it's concise and has the same, everybody is able to interpret the information in the similar manner, thereby executing things to perfection, thereby increasing productivity and leaving no window or chance for ambiguity, so that it will not allow different outcomes to happen. And that is where this becomes important as an aspect, that organization needs to have what you call policies and procedures which can be communicated, and they then, when practiced, help in maintaining clear channels of communication, making sure roles and responsibilities are clearly defined, and execution of these would lead to definite results which the management is expecting at the end of the day by the follow through of these policies and procedures. Is that okay?
Yeah, I have a question.
Go ahead.
On the previous slide, training and development, technology integration, compliance with legal regulations. Are they part of the policies and procedures, or is it an explanation to?
So these are not part of policies and procedures, but they are basically, steps which the organization needs to take. So they could be steps the organization, needs to take to implement these policies and procedures in a better manner within the organization. Is that okay?
Yes, that's fine.
So when we look at, the example of surgery that I'd given, and you are going in for a blood test, what happens is you go and meet the receptionist, but at some stage there's a use of technology. So what they say is, can you take a seat? And they give you a coupon. So your counter number comes in and you're able to see that displayed on the television, or maybe some sort of a display which says now next person, patient 21 or 22 needs to go. So there's a use of technology. Sometimes you would see integration of this being done through the point of view of, check-in terminals. So for example, if you go into a surgery, you generally see that maybe some part of your report, your repeat prescription, or maybe some information that needs to be communicated is done through the use of, television or static displays. And this can be done essentially, for the purposes of providing information to you, and then it is primarily done, using technology. And technology integration is, now a part and parcel of most organizations, because it is like, for example, emails. Earlier, it used to be all letters or postcards or, posts sent through, postal routes, communication or documents sent through postal routes. But emails now have made it efficient, or, even sometimes live video conferences or meetings have made it easier for people to interact and, communicate things at a quicker pace. And that is where technology integration has happened. But all this is essentially helping, communication to happen in a better, efficient, and a quicker way. Now, let's look at assessment criteria 1.3, wherein it is talking about outlining some of the compliance-related legislation which, employers and organizations need to follow when we talk about communication. Now, one of the aspects that we looked at in this slide was compliance with legal regulations. Now, you have lots of policies and procedures within the organization, but there are some policies and procedures which the government, or in some cases the key government, when I say key policies, on which, let me rephrase this. So in some cases, when we talk about certain standard practices which are related to communication, sometimes what happens is government introduces certain acts or legislations which have to be followed through to ensure that they allow the communication of information to happen as per a definitive process. Now, when this is to be done and it is related to legal compliance, that means it is a mandatory, let's say, it is obligation and it is mandatory for the company, organization, or a business to follow that, then it is called as regulation. Or in this case, the regulation created by the government will be producing what is called an act. And this act then has to be incorporated into the policies or procedures of the organization. I'll give you a simple example in this. When we talk about, patients and patients' data within the National Health Service in the UK, this data has to be kept, let's say this data has to be, have and needs to have restrictive access. This data cannot be shared with insurance companies or, employers or private companies outside, because they would exploit by using this data for charging higher insurance premiums to customers when they know the medical history of the patient. So in some cases, if you have diabetes, for example, or if you have, say, for example, some sort of a underlying condition, and if that is known to your insurance company, then your health premium or health insurance premium can rise. So all data that is collected about patients within the National Health Service in the UK has to follow a particular, process. And that process of, storing, retrieving, and providing access to that data to different people working within the organization has to be restricted. And this is a compliance which is something which all hospitals, surgeries, pharmacies, any sort of a health and social care setup has to follow if they collect, retain, and maintain patient data. Now, this particular compliance falls under what is called the Data Protection Act of 2018 in the UK. Initially, it was introduced in 1998, and then the further updates to this act were introduced because of the General Data Protection Guideline or regulation being included, because of European Union introducing GDPR, and this Data Protection Act was, updated to the newer version of Data Protection Act of 2018. Now, what does this say? This is a regulation or an act which has been introduced by the government, which basically says that there are rules and regulations that all organizations have to follow with regards to processing of personal data of customers. When you visit a website, and when you visit a particular website, the website collects data by, asking you to click on a cookie to say, do you allow for this information to be used for certain purposes? Now, what they are doing is they are collecting data, and they are by default, because of this Data Protection Act, obliged to store, maintain, and provide access to this data, restricted access to this data to number of people as and when required. And this should not be used for, say, in the case of websites, for marketing purposes. If you click deny, that means this data cannot be used for marketing purposes. So when we look at this aspect of Data Protection Act, this is one of the several legislations which are required to be followed when companies are looking at creating their policies and procedures for the purposes of communication within the organization. So there are lots of different acts. One such act is Data Protection Act, and that basically means that how an organization collects, stores, and shares personal information has to be compliant with the principles of data protection as defined by the government of UK in the Data Protection Act of 2018. And an example of that would be a surgery storing patient record and patient data, but they would be not obliged to share that data with any third party, because they would need to take consent from the patient first to be able to share that data outside. That data is going to be confidential, is going to be maintained, and people within even the surgery, some people will have restricted access to that data because it needs to comply with the regulation. And for that, the surgery would have a policy which is called the data communication policy, and in that data communication policy, they would make use of the Data Protection Act to inform various employees, people, contractors, suppliers, workers working with the surgery to say that if you come in contact with this data, this is how it has to be handled. This is what can be the do's, and this is what are the don'ts, and you would need to comply. If we do not comply with this regulation, then we are in breach of the government law, and that could lead to fines, because GDPR is implemented by a government organization in the UK called the Information Commissioner's Office, or ICO. So if you're not following the data compliance and data protection guidelines, then in those cases, customers, if they complain, then the organization can be liable for fines, and the data protection officer, would be liable to, there might be sanctions which might be put in. And, in some cases, there are further repercussions in terms of legal challenges, and even criminal charges can be filed. So depending on what is the breach which can happen, there are repercussions which the organization can face, and that is why these legislations or laws are outlined by the government in various acts. And when the organizations form their communication policies or policies related to storing data, they would need to have a data communication policy in which they will need to adhere to the Data Protection Act and the GDPR Act of 2018. Now, there are various other legislations which are important in the field of making sure that relevant communication procedures and protocols are followed. One of such acts is called the Freedom of Information Act. Now, this act, when we look at BBC, or when we look at some of the news networks, if they need to retrieve or gather information from public authorities or public sector enterprises, government organizations, then they can use the FOIA Act, sometimes also called the Freedom of Information, Act. And they can use this act to request to get information from, government organizations, and that tends to be useful when they want to take information in public interest and seek information from government organizations in public interest, and they then can quote the Freedom of Information Act to be able to gather that information. Now, there are other acts like the Equality Act of 2010, which basically says that no discrimination can be done on the basis of age, gender, disability, race, or religion. And this is something which all organizations need to communicate to their employees, that there can be no injustice or discrimination carried out on the basis of where people come from, what culture they belong to, what is their race or religion. And this is covered under the Equalities Act of 2010. Give you a simple example. Here in this case, imagine if you work within a pharmacy which is attached to a big surgery, and the pharmacy is going to advertise for a job. Now, when they advertise for a job, if they say that we need a receptionist and they say female candidates only apply, or if they put in an age bracket of candidates only between the age group of say 20 to 24 may apply, or 24 to 28 may apply, then in this case what is happening is that the organization is in breach of the Equalities Act of 2010, because they're highlighting something which cannot be used to discriminate against people that would want to apply for that particular job. Now, if I say female only apply, that means I'm being injustice, I'm being indiscriminate, and I'm already not looking at taking interviews from male candidates or CVs from male candidates. So this would lead to discrimination. If I say only age group of 24 to 28 apply, or only people who are single and not married apply, then these are bits which we as an organization would be in breach of, because the Equalities Act is not being followed, and discrimination is being done on the basis of their age, their race, their religion, or in some cases, on the basis of their sex, and that would be not allowed under the Equalities Act of 2010. Then there are acts which is called the REPA, Regulatory or Investigatory Powers Act. Now, this act basically allows government bodies to be able to regulate and intercept communications such as emails and telephone calls. And this is to basically maintain, for example, national security, or in some cases, so that organizations do not infringe on individuals' privacy. And acts like the Telecommunication Act, you look at the Employment Act of 1996, you also look at the Communication Act of 2003, and some of the other acts which are basically related to compliance side of things, have to be followed in general by I would say let's say the organizations, when they come out with their policies and procedures. And the reason why they have to follow this is primarily because at the end of the day, they need to ensure that they're, they are adhering to the compliance side of things, which the organization, which the government has put in place, and they are using those compliances, regulations, and legislations to carry out their day-to-day responsibilities when, while at the same time taking into account the minimum, the basic minimum requirements, what the government is highlighting to follow when it comes to certain of these acts and procedures, or certain of these acts and legislations, which have to be formulated into policies and procedures and adapted into policies and procedures within the organization. Is that okay? So legislations in general are...
I have a question.
Yeah, so legislations in general are required to be followed by organizations in the UK, because it is going to help them adhere to or follow the laws which have been set for compliance, and that would help protect individual rights and also maintain ethical communication practices within organization. Is that okay? Now, we go to the last assessment criteria of Learning Outcome 1, wherein it talks about, organizational structures and the impact on communication methods. Now, when we need to look at impact of the organizational structure, first let's understand what are the various structures of which are prevalent within organization. Now, there can be four broad types of structures. One is functional, divisional, matrix, and flat. Now, depending on the size and scale of the organization, you would see different structures within different organization. Imagine a small business, and when you look at a small business, if there are 5-6 employees, there's a director of the organization, and there are employees who work in sales and finance or administration. They would normally have a very flat structure because each of these employees would have direct access to their manager or the director. And in such cases, decision making is quicker, faster. And because of the lesser number of employees in the organization, the structure tends to be flat because there are no departments. Then we look at divisional structure. If you look at big organizations which have lots of departments and lots of products and services that they sell to customers, then generally you would see a divisional structure because it is allowing the company or the organization to arrange their department and functions in a structured manner. And in such cases, you would generally see division. Now, this could be an example of a hospital. If you have a hospital, you'll have somebody who's the chief executive of the hospital or the clinical director. And within that, you have various different departments within a hospital. Things like you have a cardiac department, you have go on.
I have a question. I haven't been hearing what you've been saying because of my connection.
Mm-hmm.
I had a question from the Freedom of Information Act 2000.
Yes.
I wanted to ask, is the Equality Act Regulation of Investigatory Powers Act and the rest, are they under the Freedom of Information Act, or they are under the different legislations? Like,
No, these are all individual acts. Freedom of Information Act is different, Equality Act is different, REPA Act is different, Telecommunication Act, they're all different acts. They're all different. They are not related to each other, but they are all different acts which need to be followed for the purposes of communication within the organization.
Even the Employment Rights Act?
Yes, that is also a different act. These are all different acts within themselves when we talk about, the legislation requirements which the companies have to follow when it comes to forming up their communication processes and policies.
So they all fall under that.
They're all different acts. They're all individual acts. They don't fall under each other. They're all falling under what is called legislation relevant to communication. So these are various different acts which companies have to follow when they look at their own communication policies and procedures that they form within the organization. So this could be one act is data protection. Within data protection, you have GDPR. Freedom of Information is 2, Equality 3, this is 4, 5, you have 6, 7, 8, 9 different acts which are related to meeting compliance and procedures related to legislation for an organization.
Okay, thank you. Will this handout be available for me on my Moodle? Will I be able to access?
Yes. After this session, this will be available to you along with the copy of the recording of the lecture. Yes. Okay.
Thank you.
No worries. Then we look at, just going back to the structure. So divisional structures I was mentioning could be in a hospital, wherein you have the chief executive of the hospital. There are different departments. So you have the cardiac department, you have, say, for example, an osteotherapy department, a gynae department, and within that you have different, people in different, let's say, structures and different number of people working within the organization. We then look at matrix structure. Matrix structure tends to be based on when an organization has lots of cross-functional teams and functions. So, for example, here in this case, if you see that there is a big organization which has a presence in Manchester, but it also has a presence in London, Birmingham, and certain other cities. So there'll be branch offices, and within those branch offices, you'll have similar functions. So every branch would have a finance, marketing, sales, that kind of a function. So if this was talking about, various trusts the way, PCC trusts that we talk about, which maintain and run the hospitals in the UK. So there would be 1 or 2 trusts within the Greater Manchester area, just as an example, and they would own 3-4 different hospitals. And there is where you would generally see a matrix structure happening, because if the ownership of the hospitals are under one particular trust, they might say, okay, the Manchester Wythenshawe Hospital is a focused center for cardiac problems. So any such cardiac operations will happen there. If I look at Manchester Infirmary or Central Hospital, they might say, okay, all COVID-related patients normally could be referred to, because that has a specialist facility or trained staff to be able to, deliver those services to the patient. So you would generally see matrix kind of structure, because it's cross-functional and it is across various sites. Then you look at functional structure. Functional structure could be a structure which is normally based on functions of what people do within the organization. So you could have a marketing function, a sales function. In the case of doctors, you could have consultants, you could have healthcare, you could have social workers, you could have nurses. And in some of those situations, these functions would then be looking at providing or, doing most of the services, which are required to be given to the patients in hospitals or in different setup of hospitals. Now, these broad structures can be useful to develop a type of a communication structure within the organization. And what we need to do is, why we need to understand the organizational structure is to understand what could be the impact it has on the communication policies and procedures within an organization. So when we talk about different types of structures, they can also influence how you are going to be able to communicate within the organization. If I look at a flat structure, sending out a piece of information is going to be quite easy, because you have direct access to most of the employees, and maybe the owner of the organization or the main or a manager of the organization might want to communicate directly to somebody, and they could straight away just pick up the phone, or if they sit within the same office or are working within the same department, they could straight away meet up and then communicate the information. And this would facilitate what is called mostly direct interaction with the team members. But if I look at a big hospital, if something has to be sent across, to the employees, that, okay, we need to be looking at improving our patient turnaround times, which are currently in excess of 1 hour, to bring it down to half an hour. Now, this approach of, a policy or communication would follow a top-down approach. That means the chief executive or the top person in the management would need to communicate to the department managers. The department managers would then communicate to supervisors, and supervisors would then communicate this message or articulate this message for communication to workers at their end in their way, so that they can then get this into practice. So when we look at a top-down approach of communication, you would generally see that this would be available in what is called a hierarchical organization, or an organization wherein there is a formal structure present, wherein you have top management, middle management, junior management, and then people or workers essentially working on the working and delivering services to patients or being in direct touch with the patient. One of the things that you have to also understand is that when we look at size and scale of the organization, that can also influence, the communication methods. Larger organizations sometimes tend to have more complex structures, and smaller organizations will tend to have more simple and direct communication structures. So when we talk about a flat structure, that would be generally seen in an organization wherein there are 2, 3, 4 employees. If I talk about a pharmacy, you generally see a flat structure, because the pharmacist, who's maybe the main person in the pharmacy, and there are 2 or 3 people who work in the front desk, meet customers, take their prescriptions, and then they go back to the pharmacist to prepare the prescriptions and the medication which is required to be given. You would generally see a flat structure, because in those cases, they interact with the pharmacist. If they have any query, ask, and then prepare the medication, and obviously then straight away give it to the customer. But if I talk about a larger organization like a hospital or maybe a surgery, in this case, what you will generally see is that there could be a complex structure, because if a patient comes with a complex problem or that needs to be looked into immediately, the surgery would get in touch with the hospital and straight away call an ambulance service, which would take the patient from the surgery to the hospital, because the treatment required might not be possible within the surgery. So in such cases, you would see more complex structures, because the doctor might speak to the consultant first at the hospital and say that this is a patient come in with the clinical or a chronic illness and needs immediate attention. The consultant might say, okay, these are the steps that we need to take, get him admitted, and send him over. And that could be a complex set of procedures or communication procedures which need to be followed to ensure that the patient is effectively looked into straight away. And then when we talk about why is communication important from an aspect of the organizational structure, is because sometimes you would see from research, it has been seen that effective communication tends to be achieved if processes and procedures are followed. And in some cases, specific requirements need to be met in terms of defining a structure or a hierarchy which would allow the information to flow in a manner which would be suitable and more relevant for that particular part of the organization. And that would be facilitated through a particular, let's say a structure. Now, when we look at an example of an organization, let's take up a business. And in that organization, if you have lots of different types of people working within, say, different departments, if I look at customer service as one department, you would generally see that in customer services, the number of channels through which the information has to pass through is normally less, because what the focus of the organization is to essentially provide a solution to the customer in the shortest possible time, rather than have a lot of channels to go through or hierarchies or levels to go through. That is where, the customer might become impatient and, might complain that my problem is not being resolved. So when you look at such places or situations wherein customer service is involved, you would generally see if the problem is received, the person will straight away go back to the manager, get a decision, get an authorization, and then communicate to the customer that, okay, this product which you have received is faulty. We will have it collected and a new product will be delivered. Now, this would help you save the sale or, ensure that you are able to retain the customer and also complete the sale rather than lose the sale or revenue altogether for the organization. So sometimes you would have to look at creating or making sure that the process through which communication is done is streamlined in order to ensure that faster response times can be given to the customer. And thereby, this will impact the overall success, of the organization in terms of how they deal with a particular complaint. So when we talk about structures, it is important to understand what kind of an impact it can have on the channels of communication. And it is important for the organization to consider carefully how the communications are done, how effective that channel is, and how many people are involved in the communication process, so that at the end of the day, the communication can be done swiftly, effectively, and it can help in resolving the problems of the customer or the patient. And that is where the structure of the organization can play an important part. Is that okay? Any questions on this so far? Okay. Okay, so that brings us to the end of today's session, in which we have covered learning outcome 1, which is to understand the communication practices within the organization. And what I will do at the end of this session is also provide and ask you to go through the organizational structure handout, this presentation, and this particular article, through which I've shown you the video initially, which focuses on talking about why is work communication important in a workplace. And that will help you to understand the learning outcome 1 that we've discussed in a bit more detail. And then we'll catch up in the second session, in next session, essentially to discuss learning outcome 2. If you think of any questions at any stage, or if you have any queries at any stage, then you can also write into me at learnerwork@UK Versity, and I will come back to you with additional information or details that will help you to answer that query. Okay. Thanks for joining in today, Vanessa, and I will catch up with you in the next session.